Support for WUWM podcasts comes from University School of Milwaukee, fulfilling a values-based mission of developing learners, fostering leaders, and preparing citizens for pre-kindergarten through 12th grade. More information at usm.org/mission.
Lake Effect brings you conversations about what's happening in Milwaukee and the people, places, and organizations that shape the community. This is Lake Effect Spotlight from WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR.
The nuclear family is often thought of as a pillar of American achievement. Two-parent families have been championed in both rhetoric and policy as having a key role in climbing the social ladder in the U.S., but a new book by Milwaukee-native Christina Cross is challenging this idea. Cross is a sociologist and the author of Inherited Inequality: Why Opportunity Gaps Persist Between Black and White Youth Raised in Two-Parent Families. In her new book, Cross breaks down the data along racial lines, finding that the nuclear family isn't nearly as beneficial to Black Americans as it has been for white Americans. Cross joins Lake Effect's Joy Powers to talk about her findings and how prioritizing two-parent families has shaped U.S. policy for decades.
Now, your book is really exploring a prevailing theory on familial success in the U.S., specifically this idea that the two-parent home is perhaps the ultimate equalizing force in American communities. Can you dig into that idea a bit?
Yes, well, this is an idea that's been deeply ingrained in sort of American culture and politics, and even academic research for decades. It started about 60 years ago with a report called the Moynihan Report that was focused on trying to understand the root causes of high rates of poverty among Black Americans. And Moynihan was a sociologist himself who was working in government under President Lyndon Johnson as his Assistant Secretary of Labor. And Moynihan, after about 3 months of research, concluded that at the root of high rates of poverty amongst Black Americans in the US at that time were issues of family structure, in particular high rates of single mother families and relatively higher numbers of children being born outside of marriage. And so this idea has grown and proliferated over time. It's found its way into media, it's found its way into policy, but also into academic research as well. And there are some social scientists who argue that the two-parent family is the ideal arrangement to raise children in, and it offers them the best chance of success. I think about a recent book published by Brad Wilcox called Get Married that makes that argument in particular.
As you say, this is an incredibly pervasive idea even today. Now, the Moynihan Report came out quite a while ago at this point, but there has been a lot done with the idea that this is accurate. This is an accurate perception. How has this ideal of the two-parent home impacted, especially policy and research in the U.S.?
You know, recently there have been estimates by family scholars and by historians suggesting that there are over 1,000 laws, policies, and practices that advantage marriage in the two-parent family over all other types of families in the U.S. So it's had a broad impact on the way that our government regulates society. One particular piece of legislation is the Personal Responsibility Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act that was passed in 1996. And this piece of legislation is really important for a number of reasons, but one, because it created what we now refer to as welfare, the official name being Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. And this is our primary program for providing cash assistance to low-income families with children. And this program, TANF, 3 of its goals focus on promoting marriage and a two-parent family as part of a federal strategy to improve child well-being, but also to reduce inequality, including along racial lines. So they're received with one of the most prominent safety net programs of our time, how these ideas have been baked into the goals of the program. But of course, it's not limited to policy, even though that's really important and powerful for shaping our lives. But It's also an idea that comes up in a number of academic studies as well. And I mentioned the book Get Married. There was also another book recently written called The Two-Parent Privilege by an economist by the name of Melissa Kearney. And while their arguments differ, there's consensus amongst these two social scientists and others who are of similar mindset that one of the most important ways for Americans to close gaps between the haves and have-nots is to get married, is to raise children within the context of a two-parent family.
Now, of course, these other sociologists, these other researchers, they're also relying on numbers and charts and, the kinds of evidence that one might want for this kind of claim. What do you think they have failed to see in their research that you were able to find in this book?
Well, there are two very important things to keep in mind that help to sort of square the evidence between my book and other books that have been recently published. The first and really important thing is that prior to my book, a lot of the research had focused on looking at the average sort of benefit of living in a two-parent family, relying on nationally representative data, which in general is, helpful information to have. But what that means is that we get effect across all racial and ethnic groups in the US, across all income groups as well. What I found in my book and what I focus on is what the effect or what the benefit of living in a two-parent family is, specifically for African American children. And unfortunately, they don't reap the same rewards as sort of the average benefit, and especially as their white peers who also grew up in two-parent families, which is why it's really important to, understand what the average return on this family structure is, but also to look within groups. And there had been very, very little research that had explored what it means to live in a two-parent family for African American children. When I was doing background research for my book, I only found two studies out of nearly 200 in the past decade that had examined the outcomes of Black children in two-parent families. So you have to be careful not to overgeneralize. The other thing that I think is really important to remember and is a key distinction in the arguments that I'm making versus other scholars is that while children who live in a two-parent family do tend to outperform their peers who live in other types of families, we have to be careful to not confuse correlation with causation. And what do I mean there? Well, it's possible that living in a two-parent family tends to be associated with better outcomes for children, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it causes the better outcomes for children. And there's this causal question that we have to really keep in mind. What I found in my research, and actually what has been shown in other studies as well, is that while children who live in two-parent families tend to perform better on average than those in other arrangements, a lot of that has to do with the conditions that typically accompany living in a two-parent family, like higher income, like more monitoring and supervision. Now the question becomes, are those things possible? Are they available in other types of family structures? And if they are, then is the two-parent family required to guarantee children's success? That's the question.
Sure. It seems like when the Moynihan report was first commissioned, part of what it was trying to do was figure out a way to combat racial inequities. As you dug into the numbers here, as you were looking at different markers of success, what did you actually find as you looked at the impact of two-parent homes?
Yes. So what I found is that on average, and similar to other research, children who live in two-parent families tend to outperform their peers who live in single-parent families. However, the resources and outcomes of the two-parent family are drastically different between Black and white children who grew up in this arrangement. Black children face a substantial educational and labor market disadvantage relative to their white peers who grow up in two-parent families. And what this means is that, contrary to popular belief, the two-parent family is not this great equalizer that for decades we have been led to believe. Inequality is still high between children who grow up in the socially promoted two-parent family.
This is Lake Effect. I'm Joy Powers, and I'm speaking right now with Christina Cross, author of Inherited Inequality. One of the interesting things you confront in this book is simply that people have a hard time accepting this counter narrative that two-parent homes may not be the cure-all that some hope. Why is that?
First, I want to acknowledge that this is a very common belief. It's a belief that, as we talked about a bit earlier, is longstanding. But also, I'll say that I myself grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, believing in the power of the two-parent family. It's ingrained in our culture. It's ingrained in what we see on television, what's presented in the media. And so we've had for a very long time this story about the power of the two-parent family for closing gaps in inequality between racial groups. And when we don't have much evidence to the contrary, when we haven't actually explored what it means to live in a two-parent family, which is what my book does, it's easy to go along with that story because there's nothing to question or challenge our assumptions, which is why I believe my book is so important to be able to offer us some actual evidence about the power and limits of the two-parent family for shaping children's well-being, but also reducing racial inequality.
With that in mind, as you think about your audience reading this book, what do you hope they take away? What do you hope they get from this book?
Stories, as we have witnessed from this story about family structure, are incredibly powerful in shaping the way that we think about a problem like racial inequality, but also what kinds of solutions that we come up with to address it. And for so long, the story about racial inequality had been a story about family structure and the fact that certain groups, like African Americans, did not live in the quote unquote right family structure. And if only they could embody the two-parent nuclear family, this would really level the playing field for them and other groups. Well, I love to change that story. That's what my book seeks to do. It seeks to help us better understand what the consequences of living in a two-parent family are, help us to realize that there can be real benefits for children of all groups, but that the two-parent family is no cure-all. It's no panacea. And without additional support, without additional government action, unfortunately, racial inequality will persist.
What do you see as some solutions to create real equality or at least drive toward equality?
That's a great question. And the answer to that is partly rooted in why opportunity gaps exist between Black and white children from two-parent families in the first place. So, what I found is that one of the key driver of gaps and outcomes between children was actually differences in access to economic resources. So, Black children in two-parent families had only access to about 60% of the household income and 25% of the household wealth of white children in two-parent families. So, there are these really substantial gaps in economic resources. And that's what's leading to this inequality between the two groups. So, if we want to turn things around, we have to figure out ways to close gaps in economic resources. And there have been a number of recent policies that have helped to bolster the resources of families that were struggling or that were even middle income that we can rely on. For example, we can think about the child tax credit during the COVID-19 pandemic that actually helped to lift millions of children out of poverty. It really helped to significantly improve the financial standing of millions of American households. Unfortunately, at this time, we are experiencing the opposite of that, with there being massive cuts to public spending on families. We were not able to continue with the expanded child tax credit, but there have also been cuts to SNAP and Medicaid and Children's Health Insurance Program, or even disaster relief. And all of these things make it harder for families to stay afloat, but it also magnifies gaps in economic resources. So moving in actually the opposite direction that we're in now, I think is really important if we want to help level the playing field.
Yeah, it's difficult in a landscape where it seems like a lot of resources are being pulled away to really address these kinds of inequalities and not exacerbate them.
Exactly.
Well, Christina, thank you so much for joining us here on Lake Effect and sharing your work.
Thank you. This has been wonderful. Thanks for having me.
Christina Cross is a Milwaukee native and an assistant professor of sociology at Harvard University. She spoke with Lake Effect's Joy Powers about her new book, Inherited Inequality: Why Opportunity Gaps Persist Between Black and White Youth Raised in Two-Parent Families.
You can find more interviews like this one by visiting wuwm.com/Lake Effect. And while you're there, subscribe to the Lake Effect Spotlight podcast.